Jake sat in the dimly lit meeting room, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of the table. The soft hum of the fluorescent lights above was the only sound in the room, but inside his mind, a storm raged. His face was drawn, eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights. He was supposed to be the one to comfort and guide others, but today, he was the one who needed help. "Hi, my name's Jake," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "And I'm here to tell you about my story." The room was filled with men, some older, some younger, who nodded knowingly. They didn't need to ask for details. The look on his face said it all. A man on the edge of collapse, struggling with the weight of betrayal and loss. Jake had always thought he had a perfect life. A steady job, a house in the suburbs, and a wife, Lisa, who he believed loved him. For years, he had been proud of the life they had built together. But in the past few months, something inside him had started to unravel. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," Jake continued, taking a deep breath to steady himself. "I always thought Lisa and I had the kind of marriage people dream about. We met in college, got married when I was starting my career. We talked about kids, about getting old together, about growing together in every way possible. But now, I'm not so sure." The men in the room exchanged glances, some of them shifting uncomfortably, others looking at him with understanding. "How many of you have ever been completely blindsided?" Jake asked. His voice cracked a little, but he didn't care. He needed to get this out. "How many of you thought everything was fine, until one day it wasn't?" There was silence as the group processed his words, but Jake felt the collective weight of their unspoken support. He wasn't alone. "Lisa and I had everything," Jake said, clenching his jaw. "But recently, I don't know, something changed. She started acting different, saying strange things. I thought it was just a phase. But then," Jake trailed off, staring into the empty space before him. "Then, I started hearing things that made me question everything. About her, about me, about us." The room fell into a deep quiet as Jake's words lingered in the air. The men waited for him to continue. Jake leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table as he recounted the years that led up to the current chaos. He took a deep breath, as if steeling himself for what came next. His eyes flicked to the group of men around him, friends who had known him for years, but tonight felt like a different kind of audience. This was personal. This was real. "You know, it's funny," Jake started, shaking his head with a half-hearted chuckle. "I spent years building this life. This house, everything. I worked my ass off for it, literally. I spent months designing it, picking out the materials, the flooring, the kitchen appliances. I remember the day the first wall went up. I was so damn proud. It felt like we were building something that would last forever." He paused, glancing around at the other men. "I even picked out the furniture. I wanted the house to be perfect, not just for me, but for Lisa too. I thought if we had a place we could both be proud of, it would keep us grounded. I put so much thought into it, the perfect dining table, the right sofa, the home theater system we both loved. I wanted it to be our sanctuary, you know?" There was a brief silence as Jake ran a hand through his hair. He had the look of a man still trying to reconcile his efforts with the emptiness he now felt. "And for a while, it worked. It really did," Jake continued, his tone softening slightly. "We'd sit together at that dining table, eat dinner, watch movies, talk about the future. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Or at least, that's what I thought. But then things began to change, slowly at first, small, almost imperceptible shifts." Jake's voice grew quieter as he spoke, the weight of those changes pressing down on him. "I noticed Lisa starting to spend more and more time on her phone. She'd take it everywhere, into the bathroom, into the bedroom, even during dinner. When I asked her about it, she just brushed off. Just reading a book, she'd say. It's nothing, Jake, but I could tell she was reading something different. At first, I thought it was just one of those self-help books, but after a while, I started noticing the titles." Jake's eyes narrowed, his hand resting on the table, clenched in a tight fist. "One day, I picked up one of the books she had left lying around. It was called The New Era of Relationships by some author I'd never heard of. The subtitle: Exploring the Concept of Open Marriage. I didn't know what to think. It didn't make sense. I mean, where was this coming from? We'd never talked about open relationships, never even hinted at anything like that. He looked up at his friends, his expression a mixture of confusion and disbelief. And it wasn't just one book. There were more. Books on polyamory, on non-monogamy. I never said anything at first because I thought maybe it was just a phase or something she was exploring for herself. But it didn't feel like that. It felt like she was trying to convince herself of something. Jake took a deep breath and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling for a moment, as if trying to make sense of it all. It wasn't just the books. I started noticing other things, little signs. She'd get defensive if I asked about her day, or if I even tried to get her to open up. It was like she was hiding something. She wasn't the woman I married anymore. She was distant. At this point, Jake's voice grew more measured, almost cold. I didn't know what to think. I mean, I was trying to be a good husband. I was there. I built this home for us. I did everything I could make her happy. But now, it was like I didn't even know who she was anymore. And then she started talking about open marriage. Not directly, but she dropped these hints. Maybe some people need a little more space, Jake. Maybe it's normal for people to be attracted to others. And every time she said something like that, it felt like a punch in the gut. The men around the table exchanged glances, some looking uncomfortable, others more curious, but all were listening intently. Jake looked back at them, his face a mixture of anger and sorrow. And the worst part, I kept second-guessing myself. Was I just being insecure? Was I overreacting? But there was this gut feeling, this voice in the back of my mind telling me that something was wrong. So I started to dig into it. I talked to her friends, asked people who knew her well, anything to get some clarity. But nobody seemed to know anything. Everyone just said, "Oh, Lisa's been going through something lately." He exhaled sharply, frustration creeping back into his voice. I couldn't get a straight answer from anyone, and Lisa, well, she just kept dodging my questions. It was like she was living in a completely different world, a world that didn't include me. He fell silent, as if the words had drained him. The men around the table sat still, sensing the weight of Jake's struggle. Jake's eyes turned cold for a moment, a flicker of resolve crossing his face. So I did what I had to do. I set up cameras around the house. I needed proof, you know. I needed to see for myself what was really going on. And when I watched the footage, it was worse than I could have imagined. Jake's fingers tapped nervously on the edge of his coffee mug as he recounted the moment that shattered his world. I installed spy cameras in the house. I remember the first time I sat down to watch the footage, Jake said, his voice thick with the weight of the memory. I was already on edge, but nothing could have prepared me for what I was about to see. He paused, his gaze drifting off to the side for a moment, as though trying to push back the feelings that were rising to the surface. At first, it was small things. Just Lisa, walking through the house, talking on the phone. Nothing major. But then, a few days into it, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Lisa was in the living room, talking to someone I didn't recognize. A man. And they were laughing. Too much. It wasn't just a casual conversation. There was something more. They kept getting closer. The chemistry was undeniable. My heart sank, but I kept watching. Jake shook his head, unable to hide his bitterness. And then it happened. I saw Lisa kiss him, full on the lips. I couldn't believe it. I sat there, watching it over and over again. The same thing, her kissing him like it was nothing. It was like a punch to the gut every time I replayed it. I had no idea who he was, where he came from, or what the hell they were doing in our house. A deep silence filled the air around the table, the men listening in rapt attention, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others clearly uncomfortable. The next few weeks were a blur, Jake continued, his voice trembling slightly. I confronted Lisa about what I'd seen. I didn't hold back. I told her I knew. I told her everything. I wasn't going to pretend anymore. At first, she denied it. She said it was nothing, that I was overreacting. But the truth was right there, in the video. I showed her. She couldn't deny it anymore. Jake's expression grew darker. It wasn't just that kiss. It was the whole damn relationship. This man, his name was Ethan, had been coming over for weeks. Sometimes when I wasn't home. Sometimes when I was, but I didn't know what was happening right under my nose. She was sneaking around, and I had no clue. The men exchanged uneasy glances, but Jake seemed almost detached now, like he was recounting someone else's tragedy. And Lisa, she didn't even apologize. She didn't even seem sorry, Jake muttered, his voice laced with disbelief. She just sat there, cool as ice, and told me it was all part of the open marriage thing she'd been reading about. She told me she wanted to explore her feelings for other people. She said she'd been feeling unfulfilled for months, and I hadn't even noticed. She'd already decided that this was the new way forward for us. He shook his head in frustration. I couldn't even process what she was saying. My brain was racing. My heart was pounding. But she kept going. She told me she was tired of feeling trapped, tired of the old expectations. It was clear that she'd been planning this for a while. She didn't seem to care about what I thought, what I felt. I was just some bystander in her life now. The table was silent as Jake paused to catch his breath. I asked her how she could betray me like that, how she could betray everything we had built. And she just looked at me calmly and said, "Get this, Jake, you're a great husband. You're a good man. But I'm not sure I can be what you need anymore." Jake's jaw tightened as he pushed through the bitterness rising in him. I was furious. I thought about everything we'd built. The house, our life, the future I thought we had. It all felt like a lie, a joke. I mean, why didn't she just tell me from the start? Why the deceit? But she didn't care. All she cared about was her happiness. Jake's hands clenched into fists as he continued, voice low but full of emotion. Honestly, I don't even know how I held it together. But then, after a few days of this Cold War, she made a proposal. She said I could explore things too. That if I wanted to see other people, I could. That we could just be open about it. She was so matter-of-fact about it, like she was doing me a favor. It wasn't about saving the marriage or even us. It was about her freedom. Jake paused, letting the weight of his words settle. I told her, no, this isn't how we fix things. This is how we destroy them. She didn't get it, though. I knew I wasn't the one who was broken here. The men remained quiet, the gravity of the situation sinking in. Jake had always been the rock in their group, steady and reliable. Seeing him so shaken, so vulnerable, was a sobering sight. But that's not even the worst of it, Jake said, his voice now lowering to a whisper. A few days later, I found out that Lisa wasn't the only one keeping secrets. She had been seeing Ethan, and others. At least 2 other men. She'd been building a whole new life, while I was none the wiser. And it wasn't just physical. She was emotionally involved with them too. Jake's face twisted with a mixture of pain and anger. It wasn't just cheating. It was betrayal on a whole different level. It was like she had checked out of our marriage a long time ago and was living this other life. And I was just an afterthought. Jake leaned forward, his hands gripping the mug in front of him. His eyes were distant, as if he was reliving every painful moment. When I think back to that time, he started slowly. I realized that Lisa wasn't the woman I had married anymore. The woman I loved. She was gone. All those years, all that effort I put into building our life, it was like she'd never cared. She didn't want any of it. I mean, I built this house. I picked out everything, from the kitchen tiles to the furniture. I worked so hard, thinking we were building a life together. He paused, his expression darkening. And then she just changed. Out of nowhere, she started talking about open marriages. I'd never even heard of it before. She said it was normal, that it was the new thing, and I was the one holding her back. I couldn't understand it. It was like I didn't even know her anymore. Jake looked down for a moment, collecting himself before continuing. Honestly, that was the moment I realized this wasn't the woman I'd fallen in love with. She was telling me it was all okay, like I was the one being unreasonable. I felt like I'd wasted all these years on someone who never cared about the same things I did. It was a psychological blow. I felt like I didn't know who she was or what I had been living for. Jake sighed deeply. After that, I didn't know what to do. I couldn't just sit there, drowning in anger and confusion. So, I started jogging every morning, just to clear my head. and I called up an old family friend, Marissa. She was a spiritual counselor. I thought maybe I needed some kind of guidance, because I didn't know how to move forward. He shook his head, a small, bitter laugh escaping. You wouldn't believe it. Here I was, this guy who never bought into all that New Age stuff, but I was desperate. And, in a way, it helped. Marissa helped me start thinking about things differently. I had to find a way to move on, for my own sanity. I wasn't sure what the future held, whether Lisa and I could fix anything, but I knew one thing. I couldn't keep living in the past. Jake took another sip of his drink, his eyes meeting the listeners. I'm not the same person I was back then, but it took a lot to get to this point. I just had to keep going. Jake leaned forward in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he recalled those pivotal days. His voice dropped to a lower, more controlled tone. At first, I didn't know what to do. I mean, when someone you've spent your whole life with, someone you thought you knew better than anyone else, just throws it all away like that, it hits you hard. But I wasn't going to be the one left holding the pieces. Lisa thought she could get away with everything. Cheating, lying, breaking the marriage into pieces. She thought I'd just accept it and let her keep everything, including my dignity. Jake paused, his hand clenched into a fist before he relaxed it. The memories were still fresh, and the anger lingered, but now it was focused. I took action. First, I called my lawyer. I didn't just sit around and feel sorry for myself. No. I started making plans. Divorce papers were drawn up. Every detail was covered. I didn't want her to think she could walk away from this unscathed. She'd already taken everything from me. My trust, my sense of security, my peace of mind. But she wasn't going to take the life I'd built. I was going to make sure of that. Jake's eyes flickered for a moment, remembering the exact day Lisa left for her work trip. He had watched her go, still carrying that smug look in her eyes, unaware that she had no idea what was waiting for her. He took a deep breath and continued. When she was gone, I didn't waste any time. I hired a crew to come in. I made sure they were discreet. We moved everything. Every last thing I had bought, every piece of furniture I had carefully chosen, every artwork I'd spent hours picking out gone. I had it all taken out of the house. The kitchen set, the living room couches, the expensive rug I bought on a whim because I thought it would look good with the paint color, gone. And not only that, I listed the house for sale. Jake's mouth twisted in a grim smile as he remembered the look of shock on Lisa's face when she walked through that door. I knew what I was doing wasn't just about taking the material things. It was about sending a message. It was about showing her that I wasn't some fool who would just sit back and let her destroy everything. I wasn't some guy who'd let her walk away with no consequences. She thought she could have it all, have her affair, tear our marriage apart, and still get everything. But that wasn't going to happen. He looked up, his voice growing stronger now. When Lisa came back with her lover, I knew the moment she stepped through the door that she realized something was wrong. I was waiting for her, sitting there in the empty house, watching her eyes move around, looking for signs of the life she had left behind. At first, she didn't understand what had happened. She was confused. She thought maybe she was just seeing things. But then it hit her, all at once. The house was empty. The walls were bare. No furniture. No belongings. No traces of what we once had. Jake leaned back, the weight of the memory settling over him, but there was a quiet sense of satisfaction in his voice. I could see it in her face, the realization that she'd lost everything. She had tried to tear me down, but she hadn't thought for 1 second about what it would mean for her. She thought she could walk away without consequences, but I wanted her to see that she couldn't. She didn't deserve any of it. And when she saw the emptiness, I could tell it hit her hard. There was no comfort left in the house, no security in the life we had built. Everything she thought she could rely on was gone, and I wanted her to feel that loss deeply. Jake's expression hardened. And that's when I knew. This was it. I had won. It wasn't about the house, or the furniture, or even the money. It was about control. It was about me taking back the power that she had stolen from me. For the first time in a long time, I felt free. She had destroyed our marriage, but I wasn't going to let her destroy my life. Not anymore. Jake took a slow breath, looking at his hands for a moment before meeting your gaze once more. His voice grew more measured, more sure. And in that moment, I knew my life was starting over. Not with her, not in that house, but on my own terms. I had taken back what was mine, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that from me again. Jake's eyes darkened as he continued, his voice a little steadier now, but still carrying the weight of everything he had gone through. He leaned forward, hands clasped together on the table, like he was about to share a secret, a truth that needed to be told. When everything went down with Lisa, I didn't just let it slide. I wasn't going to let her keep hiding behind the lies. No, I made sure everyone knew what she had done. I exposed everything, every affair, every lover she'd been with. I went to the media. It wasn't just about getting even anymore. It was about exposing the truth. People needed to know what kind of person she was. She wasn't just a wife who'd cheated. She was a woman who tore apart her own life and tried to drag mine down with her. Jake paused, his expression sharp. He could still feel the satisfaction of having control over the narrative. The image of Lisa's face when the news broke was still fresh in his mind. I made sure the press got hold of everything, every name, every photo. It wasn't just about destroying her. It was about exposing the hypocrisy. She couldn't just get away with it, hiding behind her smile while she was sleeping around behind my back. Then came the real turning point. Jake leaned back, his face now focused with the precision of someone who had calculated every move. The one she'd been with the most, the guy she had her longest affair with. He had a wife. And I knew it. The wife had no idea about what was going on. At least, that's what I thought. But when the press got hold of the story and everything came to light, it was like everything exploded. His world came crashing down. Just like mine. Jake smiled grimly, recalling the moment he first met the wife of Lisa's lover. Her name was Rachel, a woman in her 30s, well-dressed, carrying an air of sophistication. When Jake reached out to her, she was still in shock, but she quickly realized that her husband, Jason, had been hiding something from her, something much worse than she ever thought possible. I didn't just sit back and let Jason go on with his life. No, Rachel and I, we worked together. We made sure his life unraveled. We dug into his past, his work, everything. We made sure the press got every single detail of his affairs. His reputation was shattered, his career destroyed. I remember seeing him on the news, looking like a shell of a man. He was completely broken. Jake's eyes glinted as he continued. Jason was a high-powered executive at a tech firm. He had it all. The money, the power, the status. But after Rachel and I made sure the press got everything they needed, it was all gone. His company fired him. His colleagues turned on him. The public shredded him alive. And the worst part, he couldn't handle it. He had a nervous breakdown. He lost everything. His job, his money, his reputation. All of it vanished in the blink of an eye. Jake leaned forward, a small but dangerous smile creeping onto his face. You see, Rachel wasn't just the victim here. She was smart. She didn't let herself fall into a pit of despair. She fought back. Together, we made sure Jason never recovered. I think he realized, too late, how much he'd screwed up. The man who thought he could play God with everyone's lives was the one who ended up with nothing. Jake's eyes softened, but there was no warmth in his gaze. He wasn't done yet. And Rachel, well, she wasn't going to let Jason off the hook either. She had been hurt too much. But at some point, in the midst of all the chaos, something unexpected happened. We ended up getting closer. One night, after everything had settled down, after all the destruction had been done, she reached out to me. We had this strange connection. Both of us damaged, both of us seeking something to fill the empty spaces. And we ended up having an affair of our own. Jake's face hardened as he spoke, his voice now reflective, as if he was examining the complexity of what had happened. I didn't plan it. Neither did she. But after everything, after all the pain, it was like we understood each other in ways no one else could. It was a mess. But at that point, we were both just looking for some kind of relief, some way to deal with the wreckage of our lives. And for a brief time, it helped. It gave me a sense of control again, a feeling of power I hadn't had in a long time. Jake stopped speaking for a moment, his face clouded with a mixture of satisfaction and regret. But that's the thing about revenge. It's a dirty game. It might feel good for a while, but in the end, it just leaves you more lost. I won. I destroyed Jason. I watched Lisa suffer. But in the end, I didn't feel better. I didn't feel whole. And Rachel? Well, her life didn't exactly become easier either. In the end, both of us had to deal with the aftermath of all the chaos we'd caused. Jake's voice trailed off as he leaned back in his chair, the weight of the story settling over him. The thing is, when you start playing these kinds of games, you lose a part of yourself. You lose sight of who you are and what really matters. And maybe that's the hardest lesson of all. Jake stood silently for a moment, his hands resting on the table in front of him, his eyes scanning the room. There was a heaviness in the air, but it wasn't just the weight of his story. It was the kind of silence that comes when a truth has been laid bare, one that people can't ignore, no matter how uncomfortable it makes them. He finally let out a long breath and continued, his voice a little softer now, but still carrying the same undeniable conviction. You know, everyone has their own truth. But for me, what I did was necessary. I wasn't going to let anyone, tell me that I was weak, that I didn't deserve to be happy. I wasn't going to keep living in the shadow of her lies and manipulation. My marriage was destroyed because of her cheating, her need for control. I didn't deserve that. I didn't sign up for a life of betrayal and deceit. And when she pushed me to the edge, when she thought she could get away with everything, I made sure she saw what it would cost her. The cost of destroying me, of destroying us. Jake paused, his gaze unwavering as he looked around at the men who had gathered to listen. He could feel the support in the room, and it gave him a sense of strength, a sense of closure. He knew that many of them understood his pain, even if they hadn't gone through the exact same experience. They knew what it was like to be betrayed, to lose everything, and to have to rebuild from the ground up. Lisa can live her life as she pleases. She can do whatever she wants. But I am no longer her property, Jake said with finality, the words settling in the room like a quiet storm. She can go on with her lovers, her open marriages, her endless search for something she'll never find. But I'm free. I've taken my life back. She can't control me anymore. She can't use me. And most importantly, she can't break me again. Jake took another slow breath, his eyes burning with the fire of someone who had fought to survive. My marriage was destroyed by her actions, by her choices. But now I have my freedom. I didn't get to choose how everything ended, but I did get to choose how I lived after that. And that's all that matters now. As he finished speaking, there was a silence in the room, a moment where everyone seemed to process what he had said. And then, as if a dam had broken, the men in the audience erupted into applause. It wasn't just polite clapping. No, this was approval, recognition. They understood. They didn't just sympathize with Jake. They admired his strength, his ability to take control of his life again after everything that had been ripped away from him. Jake stood tall, his chest rising with a deep breath, his head high. The applause washed over him like a wave, and for the first time in a long while, he felt seen. He felt validated. And then, amid the clapping, a voice rose above the rest. It was quiet at first, but there was something undeniably strong in it. Jake didn't need to turn to know where it came from. He could feel it. Feel the energy shift as the voice spoke. I'm alive. Jake felt the power in those words, and he smiled to himself, the weight of the past few months lifting ever so slightly. It was a declaration, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been through their own battles. The men in the room knew what it meant. They had all, in some way, fought their own wars, survived their own losses. And now they were here, alive, ready to move forward. Jake nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth of that voice. It wasn't just a statement. It was a battle cry. It was proof that no matter how much we are torn apart, no matter how much we lose, we always have the power to rise again. Lisa had done everything she could to destroy him. She had tried to break him, to make him feel worthless. But in the end, Jake had walked away with his dignity, his strength, and most importantly, his freedom. He didn't need her anymore. He didn't need anyone who tried to control him or manipulate him. He had built something new, something he could be proud of. As the room slowly quieted down, Jake stood up, his hands at his sides. He wasn't just telling his story. He was showing everyone in that room, including himself, that he was ready to move on. The pain, the heartbreak, the chaos, those things no longer defined him. His life was his own again. "Thank you," Jake said, his voice steady and strong. "Thank you all for listening. And remember, no matter what happens, no matter how far down you go, there's always a way back. I found mine. You can find yours, too." The room went silent for a moment, then another round of applause filled the space. Jake stood tall, his face resolute, as he realized he wasn't just surviving anymore. He was thriving.